Team Podcast. Today we're talking about the three pillars of security: compliance, defense, and offense. Joining us is Covert Access Team's Brian Harris, here to unpack how each pillar fits into a mature security program and why offensive operations provide the reality check most orgs are missing. So Brian, how do you define those three pillars and where do most teams go wrong and how they balance them?
Sure. So fundamentally, the three pillars of security are, like you said, compliance, defense, and offense. Compliance, the way that I usually define it is, it's basically just the tools that you need to be secure. So in physical security, this might be certain locks, access control systems, alarms, cameras, fences, doors. These are the things that are required in order to just be secure. Defense is, okay, how do you use those tools that you have at your discretion? So compliance is a checklist of all the things that you're supposed to have to be secure. Defense is, how do you use those tools that you were given? The offensive side of things is basically a reality check on the defensive side. So just because, you have all the tools at your discretion does not necessarily mean that you're using them in a way that prevents some kind of an attack. Usually the way that I kind of define that is, if you wanted to learn how to box, like the sport of boxing, you might need things like gloves and a punching bag and a mouth guard and hand wraps, etc. Okay, that's the compliance side of things. These are the tools that you need. Then the defensive side of things might be, okay, well, how are you using them? So you box, you do cardio, you might do some combination drills, etc. But the offensive side is basically sparring. And if you don't do that, then okay, well, you might hit the bag, for an hour every day, but you've never sparred. You've never actually been tested. And that's the aspect that a lot of people are missing. It's like, okay, well, you've done all the drills, you can do these combinations great, maybe even perfectly, but until you spar with somebody, you don't necessarily know where you stand. And in security, that really is kind of how this is that the defensive side may be doing everything perfect that's in their checklist or in their purview, but there may be things in there that they literally just didn't think about, and so they never consider.
That's a great analogy. And I feel like so many organizations lean very heavily on compliance and defense, but they really don't invest that much on offensive capabilities. Would you agree?
More or less, yes. So oftentimes we don't invest in offensive sides of things because one, it's expensive, and two, a lot of companies don't see the point. So you might have a SOC, like a security operations center with 10, 20 people in your organization, and their full-time job is some variation of making sure that we are secure at all times. Maybe it's actively monitoring things, maybe it's incident response, whatever. But when it comes to the pen testing side of things, especially internal pen testing, you may have one, maybe two people. And even though your SOC might have, everybody has various skill sets. Everybody is maybe a specialist in something specific. Your pen testers are often kind of generalists of, well, I know web apps really well, or, well, I know Active Directory and internal network stuff well. But when it comes to things, IoT pen testing or Wi-Fi or physical, these are things that they don't really transfer, especially when it comes to physical. If you can pen test a web app, if I know how to look at Facebook's login page and run the general, check for IDORs, check for your injection attacks, check for all the typical things you check with web app pen testing, that doesn't mean that you know how to pick a lock. That doesn't mean that you know how to social engineer and develop assets. That doesn't mean that you know how to scale buildings or even are capable of scaling buildings. So there's a lot of things that simply don't transfer over. But a lot of organizations, they don't think about the offensive security side of things just because budgets are always tight, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of organizations to have an army of internal pen testers.
And so when you say it's more expensive because it is always more expensive to hire out, say, consultants than to have an internal person doing it all day, every day. But if you have an internal person doing it all day, every day, you only have access to their skill set, and every physical offensive security pen tester is going to have a limited skill set. Would you agree?
Sort of, yeah. Think of it like maybe a better way of describing it would be to say that if you're trying to actively defend something, you have a job, you have a role at all times. You could be attacked at any moment from any adversary. But if you're running a pen test, you're testing the security. Well, how often can you do that before you've run out of things to test? So it's kind of like if you go to the doctor for a physical, okay, that's great, you should do that. But would you want to go to get a physical every day? I mean, eventually, this is usually how organizations think about it. And to an extent, they have a point, right? You don't necessarily need to run a pen test on a daily, weekly, or even monthly basis. The problem isn't that they don't run pen tests, because most organizations today do in some capacity. Maybe it's bug bounty hunting, maybe it's internal pen testers, maybe it's consultancy. The problem is not that they run pen tests. The problem in this context of physical security is that they don't understand the difference between physical and cyber-based security when it comes to these things. So they might run a cyber-based pen test on their web app 4 times a year, but they've never run something on their physical. And so they literally have no idea. They have no idea like where they are. And again, going back to the boxing analogy, if you have practiced boxing on a punching bag for 5 years, but you've never sparred with another human being, you have no real idea of where you are skill set wise. You just don't. You have an idea. You might have an idea in your head, but until you're actually tested, you have no idea. And so this is one of and again, this is just a common misconception of people. They say, well, Bob over here, he does web app pen testing, and we trust Bob, and he's done really good work for us before. So maybe we ask him to do a physical assessment. But these are they're not interchangeable skills. So...
Well, that really dovetails nicely with my next question, which is, are there any common misconceptions that companies have about what each pillar actually does?
I think that there's a lot of misconceptions. I think that companies and organizations tend to put more weight into different things depending simply on their own background and their own misconceptions. So some organizations may put 80% of weight into something like compliance. These are like the accountant checkbox kind of guys who say, well, if we've got all the stuff in the checkbox, we're secure. And they don't even give it any real consideration to the defensive side or offensive side. They just say, like, look, as long as we have all the things in the checkbox, that's it. That's all we need, right? So I can give you an example from PCI compliance. Banks in the first world, in order to be banks, they have to... it's like once a year, more or less, they have to do something called PCI compliance, which is just payment card industry, so credit cards, anything that deals with credit cards, debit cards, or anything else. And a part of that compliance test is a network segmentation that just says it is not possible to go from the website of, say, the bank to the mainframe where all the credit card data is stored. There is a segmentation. There's, the website is over here, segmented away from the mainframe itself. Well, that's fine, and that's great. And from a compliance standpoint, you have to have the segmentation. And if you asked, consultants or somebody to come in and test that, and they do a network topology scan, and they say, yep, you have a segmentation. It is not possible to go from the website directly to the mainframe. You pass. Most banks will look at that and say, okay, that means we're secure. Unless I breach the bank. Because there is going to be an employee or 2 or 5 who talk to the mainframe. There has to be. Somebody at the bank has to issue credit cards, adjust credit cards, remove credit cards, etc. So if you break into the bank and you find out who that is, which is not very hard because mainframe programming is very rare, so it's not difficult to figure out who has those skills, you can do things on their terminal, on their workstation, that does get you remote access to the mainframe. Now, that said, you have to have somebody on your team who knows how to program on mainframes, but you can see that from a compliance standpoint, you are impenetrable. But if you add one aspect, the physical aspect, from an offensive side of things, you're completely screwed. And so this is one of the things that, like, if you're CEO, if you're C-suite, if you're CISO or whoever, if they say, look, as long as we have the compliance stuff, we're fine. Okay, but you're not. But at the same time, you might have somebody who puts all the emphasis in defense. Very, very rarely do I ever see anybody who puts all the eggs in the offensive basket. It's almost always the defensive or the compliance.
Sure, because honestly, if you don't have those two set up, the offensive security person's job is really easy.
Oh yeah, of course. It's not that any one pillar is more or less important than any other. It is that they are all important. The problem is that oftentimes the the offensive side of the offensive pillar gets overlooked, and it gets overlooked hard. So as a result, anybody who's listening to this, if you've done various pen tests, network pen tests, Wi-Fi pen tests, web app pen tests, your client inevitably will say, that is not in scope. And that's fine. There's lots of reasons why various things are not going to be in scope, but I guarantee you that an actual adversary is not going to sit here and go, yeah, well, that probably shouldn't be in scope.
Sure. And speaking of compliance, I know a lot of times compliance is treated as the security strategy. And we talked about the risk in doing that. Can you share some other examples of how that sort of compliance mentality unintentionally creates blind spots?
Right. So I think, kind of going back a step, I think the best example I can think of off the top of my head would be that PCI compliance thing, where, you have, from a compliance standpoint, when you look at a network segmentation of a topology, for internal banks or anybody dealing with credit cards or payment cards, it may literally be impossible to go from the website or from the internet to where the credit cards or payment cards exist. So from a compliance standpoint, you're good. It's literally not possible to go from one to the other. But if you add a little out-of-the-box thinking, it's easy. It's trivial. Most companies that I deal with will typically, if they've never done a physical pen test, if they've never had a security audit, if they've never done these types of things before, one of the biggest pushbacks we are likely to get is some derivative of the phrase, we know that you can get into our building, and you can very likely get to the mainframe, and you can very likely get to the server room. So why would we pay you to do it? Because what they're really saying is that our physical security is so bad, it's so porous, that anyone with initiative and a little bit of skill is almost guaranteed to get to the parts of the building that could catastrophically destroy us. But why do we care? And that's honestly what they're saying. And then it usually defaults to, yeah, but we have cameras and you'll get caught. And then when you explain to them that security cameras are not what you think they are, and they don't do what you think they do, it suddenly, the whole thing falls apart. And it really reminds me a lot of the ransomware conversation about, say, 10, 20 years ago, when ransomware was really kind of, becoming a thing. When ransomware was starting out, nobody really took it seriously. They're like, it's a niche thing. We have security. We've got a SOC. We hire pen testers from time to time. But then when more and more companies, and especially big companies, started getting hit with ransomware or various hacks or data breaches or other things, that's when companies almost ubiquitously said, okay, we all have to do this. We all have to have backup servers. We all have to take, kind of a thought process of all right, what happens if we get hit with ransomware? What is our backup plan? How do we survive this? And it's very smart to do. But I don't think that when it comes to physical security that these companies have really thought this one through yet. They haven't really thought it through of okay, wait, what happens if this were to happen? What would we do? And further, most organizations will run phishing campaigns on their own employees, and they'll do it regularly. You don't do a phishing campaign because you legitimately think that your employees are secret FSB agents or working for the Mossad or the CCP or something. That's not why you do it. You do it because you think there is a chance that they're not being diligent and they're going to click on stuff they shouldn't. Mm-hmm. That's why you do it. Well, there is no real difference in that and me being able to trick an employee physically to do stuff that they shouldn't.
Or, hell, an employee just leaving the back door propped because they went out to smoke, or putting their password on a sticky note by their laptop, or, any number of dumb things you see on site.
Correct. So it's understanding these things and kind of looking at security from a more complete model helps to mitigate a lot of risk and a lot of threats. And it's not saying that if you don't do a pen test, you're definitely going to get hit with ransomware or you're definitely going to have somebody sneak into your building. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you limit the probability that if they tried, they'd be successful.
Mm. The PCI example is a great example of compliance not being enough. Do you have any other examples of, or maybe from other industries, of clients that were technically compliant, but were still vulnerable?
Yeah. So I very recently did a job for, I would argue, some of the highest security that exists. You're talking dozens and dozens of armed security. You're talking unclonable badges. You're talking all these kinds of things, right?
Cameras, monitors,
all of it. But because there were so many people on site, moving around, coming and going, doing these things, it overwhelms the security people to be able to monitor hundreds of people coming in and out of the building at any given time. And as a result, it's not difficult to slip in and out. It's not difficult to find routes that bypass all the security. I've talked about this a lot with front-heavy security, where you say, okay, you've got active security guards at the choke points. They're all, they're armed. They, literally have guns. Some even have heavy weapons. But if there's a route that bypasses the expected entrance, basically the funnel, then you just bypassed everything. And front-heavy security says that any person who's bypassed security must be authorized to be here, because how else did you get here? And as a result, everybody just assumes, well, if you've gotten beyond this point, you must be authorized to be here. And I can tell you that even when you're dealing with very, very high security, I mean, when I say very high security, I mean like all the security you could possibly want. But that security often breeds in complacency. Like, let me say it this way. Let's suppose that you were trying to breach into a building and that building had 50 armed private security guards. You would look at that and say, okay, nobody's going to be stupid enough to try and break in here, right? You've got cameras, you've got alarms, you've got 50 guys with guns walking around. But that also means that they become kind of complacent, where it's like, nobody's going to try this. Nobody's going to be that stupid.
Sure.
But if you do try it, because most of the guards are complacent, because they see the same thing every single day. Here's another example of security. The security guards actually bringing about the vulnerability. I was doing another very, very high security building a while back. Armed guards on site, unclonable ID badges. You had to go through, use an unclonable badge and then a biometric scan into a one-person turnstile in front of a guard to get into the front door, right? Okay, that cameras everywhere, all this kind of stuff, right? That's really good security, right? Like that, you'd look at that and say, that's awesome security, but that's awesome security for the lobby,
sure,
where they expect you to come through. I'm sitting at a kebab shop across the street doing short-range recon or long-range, depending on how you want to look at it. And at 6 a.m, I see a security guard walk outside, and he walks to an external door. He opens the door. He says something on the radio. He walks 50 feet. He opens another door, external door. He says something on the radio, and he repeats the process. And I see him do this 2 days in a row. What he was doing was that at shift change, he is coming out, and he is checking every single door, and he's checking that the physical security operations center sees that the door is open. So, okay, I opened door number 5. Did you see door number 5 open? Yep, you did. Okay, let's go to door number 6, door number 7. Okay, that's great. That's a great compliance check. Every day, let's make sure that the alarms, the cameras, the switches, all of these things are actively working and they can be checked. That's great. The problem was that he becomes complacent. Every single morning at 6 a.m., he has to do this. And he doesn't notice that some of the doors have become weathered. Some of the doors have become old. Some of the doors need some WD-40. And as a result, some of those doors took 20 to 30 seconds to fully close. Okay, well, this, you get, the guy who's pulled the night shift, the graveyard shift. Think about that. 6 a.m. is his leaving hour, which means that he started shift at like 10 p.m. He's dead tired. It's the last thing he has to do before he leaves. He's not thinking about security. He opens those doors. Yeah, I saw door number 5. Okay, did you see door number 6? And some of these doors take 20 to 30 seconds to close behind him. That's a vulnerability. But
he checked it off the checklist.
Exactly, but he checks it off the checklist. So you have compliance, which is great, but at the same time, you screw it up because you bring about other vulnerabilities because you didn't ever bother to check.
Now, we've talked quite a bit about compliance. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the pillar of defense. Defensive security is pretty foundational, but how can it give us a false sense of safety?
Right, okay.
Differing from compliance.
Yeah. So the problem with defense. So I once had, when I teach covert entry methods, I have $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 worth of equipment in a classroom, right? So it's 20 people, 30 people, 40 people's worth of stuff. And I once had a CISO look around the room in the class, and he asked me, what lock would you use to guarantee security in this room? Because you have all this expensive stuff. And I looked at him, and it was a perfect question coming from a defensive-minded person. Because he's asking what lock would ensure perfect security. And when we talked about it, I said, okay, well, let's do a little thought experiment here. Walk around the building, look at the doors and windows into this classroom, and let's ask ourselves, let's assume that it is impossible to get through the lock. Is there anything else you could do? And yeah, we found out, okay, well, you could bypass it with under-door tools. You could slip the latch, assuming the deadbolt wasn't done. There was a window, European tilt windows, that were vulnerable. We found that there was there was a master key to every key or every lock in the building inside a janitor's closet. The key box there was left unlocked. And so you start realizing that there's so many other ways to get inside that the question of what lock would you use to guarantee security is kind of irrelevant. Because it's a great question from the defense. What should I put in place? Because it's a very important question. What should I put in place to increase security? But it's not a good question in the sense of like, how do I guarantee security from like a well-rounded perspective? And that's the part of the offensive team. Is the defensive team are going to approach this from the things they already know. But if you come at a problem from some really wacky outside the box thinking, what are you going to do? So for example, most security centers, most buildings operate on basically a flat network where everybody has access to everything, right? Everyone from the CEO to the intern has access to the VIP boardroom, to the server room, to the archive room, everywhere. It's just a flat physical network. Well, what happens if the intern or the janitor or any of these people, for any reason, maybe they're bribed, maybe they're tricked, maybe they're just malicious, they want to compromise you? How do you prevent that? How do you prevent it if they all have access to everything? And it's like, well, that's an insider threat. But when it comes to physical security, insider threats are not something that most people even consider. They don't even think about it. It's not always the bad guy in the balaclava sneaking in at 2 a.m. A lot of times it's the disgruntled employee. It's the janitor who, the foreign janitor who's making $30,000 a year and you bribe him with $100,000 to go stick a bash bunny somewhere. It's these types of threats that are just as real as somebody actually sneaking into the building. And how would you fix that, right? So if the janitor has a key to go to every single room, what does it matter if the lock is unpickable?
Sure. And that dovetails nicely with the next question of what kind of assumptions do what kind of assumptions do blue teams tend to make that red teams disprove or black teams disprove in physical?
Right. So basically just that is that whatever the security of the building is, whether it's very high, whether it's very low, whatever it is, the offensive team does their best to look at the security that is currently in place and come up with a way to get in. Maybe that's social engineering. Maybe that's mechanical. Maybe you're picking locks or breaking locks or whatever. Maybe it's authorized. Authorized entrance is, can I set up a meeting with your company? Will you literally walk me through the front door? Not in tailgating, but like, could I set up a real meeting? Could I pretend to be a journalist who's writing a story about your company, right? Is there anything I could do for you to let me in? So it doesn't matter what the defense have in place. I will look at what they have, and then from what I see during my reconnaissance, I will then try to figure out a way, okay, given what they've put in place, how could I possibly bypass this? And what I'm going to do as the offensive team is I'm going to spend a lot of time locating every vulnerability I see, locating every route I can find, and then list them, most likely to succeed, least likely to succeed. And I'm going to start working them in order. Maybe I find 5, maybe I find 10, maybe I find 20, doesn't matter. But you just start, given the time you have, you just start knocking them out and saying, okay, I went through route 1, worked. Route 2, worked. Route 3, worked. Maybe route 10 didn't, and I got caught. But you just start knocking them out, and most of the time, your routes are going to be based on vulnerabilities that the defense obviously hasn't considered. Because that's how you define a route. That's how you find the vulnerabilities.
And in a way, that actually expresses the importance of defense and and offense working hand in hand, because if the defense is so lax, the offense is going to be getting some really low-hanging fruit.
Yep.
They're not going to be finding all of these nooks and crannies and unique ways in. They're literally going to be like, the door was unlocked.
Yeah, literally. So when I do a cyber pen test, and sometimes you'll do cyber pen tests for new companies that have never had a pen test before, ever. And you will find dozens and dozens and dozens of vulnerabilities. Most of them are going to be low-hanging fruit. Anybody who's ever run like a burp scan or something, so you're doing a web app scan, you're running Burp or Nessus or whatever you're running, it's going to come up with dozens and dozens of potential vulnerabilities. But if the security of the website is very poor, all of those vulnerabilities it finds are probably going to be real. They're probably going to be accurate. And it's that's all low-hanging fruit, right? But that's very similar to companies that have never done an audit. They've never done a pen test. So yes, when companies come to you and say, yeah, we know you can get inside, they're literally telling you that we know that our physical security is so poor, we've never tested it, we've never bothered to upgrade it, and we're okay with that. And it's going to be your job to kind of help them to understand, you should take this seriously, and here's why.
Sure, and I feel like the news is replete with examples of exactly why.
Literally. Well, also because, like I said, most companies, they don't think of physical security as something that needs to be taken seriously because they're trapped in this mindset of, we have alarms and cameras. And that's all you need, alarms and cameras. If you have that, you're set. But this is no different than saying that we have firewalls and antivirus so we don't ever need to consider pen testing on our website. That's ridiculous. Of course it's ridiculous. But this is kind of where the state of things are. And again, when you talk about physical audits or pen tests, most companies never consider internal threats, which is wild because they all do phishing campaigns. Despite the fact that they all do phishing campaigns, and if I ask them, why do you do it? They'd say, well, because we're concerned that, maybe the people don't know what a phishing campaign is. Maybe they don't understand what a malicious website is. Maybe they're stupid enough to click things. Okay, that's all good reasons. But then why don't you do any kind of auditing or testing, like the CAT program or something for physical?
Sure. And so offensive security is often the reality check. Can you talk about why that's so essential for pressure testing the organization's assumptions?
Yeah, so the defensive side may be doing the compliance side may have everything perfect. Their checklist is perfect. Whatever they're supposed to have, they have it. The defensive side might be doing everything perfectly. But if you come at the problem from something completely out of the box that they've never thought about or never considered, well, then you're almost guaranteed to win. That's the problem. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose for a minute that you have a client who's operating in a building and the compliance has said, we want to ensure that you have unclonable cards, like access control cards. That's part of our checklist for compliance. Great, that's awesome. And then the defensive side says, we are actively monitoring every card that goes through to ensure that nobody repeats, right? So if Bob comes into the building, we don't see Bob come back into the building 5 minutes later. Mm-hmm. Okay, great.
Before he's exited.
Right, before he's exited or something else. So you couldn't steal Bob's card or, go, whatever. Okay, that's fine, that's great. But what if Bob, the employee, holds the door open for people? Mm-hmm. Well, he's got all the stuff on the checklist, and the defensive side are monitoring everything actively for any weird stuff, but Bob's a nice guy, and a pretty girl is walking behind him, and he holds the door open for her.
And Bob happened to be the guy who clicked on the phishing campaign
last
month.
Yeah, exactly. So it's one of those things that you need to test these things, because just because the compliance is doing everything right, just because the defensive is doing everything right, it doesn't mean that your security is where it needs to be. And I will remind you that think of it this way, every person who's listening to this, if you've ever worked in an organization before, think to yourself, could I break into my own organization? And if I could, how would I do it? I am willing to bet that 90+% of you who have worked in organizations before would say, yeah, I could break into my own organization, and here's how I would do it. Mm-hmm. But why? If I asked the vast majority of people who work at organizations, do you think that you could catastrophically pen test your own company through the internet and take them down? The answer is going to be no. Okay, why is there such a disparity? If you work at Google, at Apple, at Microsoft, at JP Morgan, whatever, if you work at any of these organizations, and I asked you, any cyber-based person, do you think within 1 to 2 weeks you could probably take down your own company from the outside through the internet? And the overwhelming majority of employees are going to be like, absolutely not. I don't think that I could. Maybe if you gave me a year to develop some 0 day or something else, okay. But I probably couldn't do it in any realistic time frame. But then if I said, but what if I add a physical component? Could you sneak into your building? Could you get to the server room? Could you upload malware? Could you do whatever? The vast majority of companies and organizations are going, yeah, probably.
That said, then why do companies say, we know you could get in, we don't care?
Because they don't see it as a threat. Because they look at it and they say, well, if this was a realistic threat, why isn't it happening?
And they don't realize it is happening.
Exactly. They don't realize that it is happening.
Kind of like the early days of ransomware.
Exactly like that. So they don't tend to realize that everything from state actors to malicious employees to
business competitors
to all of these people are actively trying to always best get revenge, do malicious things. It's always this way. And again, it's literally why you do phishing campaigns. Ask yourself the question, why do we do phishing campaigns? Why do we put so much emphasis on recovery if we get hit with ransomware? Why do we do all of these things? And then take whatever answer you gave and say, why are we not doing anything when it comes to physical?
Sure.
Because what you are doing with physical typically is we have cameras, we have alarms, and that's usually it. So think of it this way. Front-heavy security says simply any person who has gotten past the first barrier must be assumed to be authorized to be here. And because most organizations have a flat physical network, meaning anyone can go anywhere and do anything they want, it's kind of like saying that if you were to bypass the login portal of Facebook, you are now on the mainframe of Facebook.
Sure.
Okay, that's really bad, right? That's kind of where you are when it comes to physical security, but most companies don't understand that. They don't seem to understand that the millions of dollars that they put into cyber-based defense is completely bypassed if I walk into the building with a bash bunny and I just walk to the server.
Gotcha. So would you say there are any kind of insights that you could literally only gain from offensive security?
Sure. Minus some very, very serious state entity level stuff, the Pegasus software, Pegasus 1, Pegasus 2, or some like just Mossad level 0-day exploits on TVs and cell phones, it would be very, very difficult to go through the internet and listen in to a boardroom meeting at a very, the heads of Pfizer, the heads of JP Morgan Chase, the heads of Facebook or Google or stuff. It'd be extremely difficult to go through the internet and listen into their VIP meeting rooms about their upcoming annual strategy and secret codes and projects. That'd be very hard to do. But not if I sneak in. Not if I put a weaponized phone in that room. Not if I've put something on the window that listens through glass. Then it's trivial. So here's the thing. If you have a business, and by the way, I'm not any of these organizations I'm listing, I'm just pulling them out, but I'm not picking on them. But if you find out that it is possible that you discover a route into a building from the outside to the VIP meeting room, and you have placed a listening device or a HDMI man in the middle or whatever in that meeting room, you now own everything that is said in there. Every meeting, every secret project, every financial decision, everything that's going on, you get to hear about it. And think about your own companies. Think about your own organizations. When was the last time you were in a meeting in the big VIP meeting room and somebody checked behind the big TV that's in there? Because they all have big TVs, right? How often do you see people checking under the tables or
in a nest of wires?
Right. It's one of those things that once these devices are planted, especially if they're planted and they're using something on the cell line, like the cell phone line, because these are not communications channels that you can control or even see. And further, the bad guy, once he's deployed it, he could be half a world away. As long as it's contacting on the cell line, I don't even need your network.
Sure.
I'm exfiltrating audio or visual or whatever I'm stealing from you, and it's going anywhere, right? So the problem here is they don't seem to understand that in a lot of ways it can be a one and done thing. I place the device, I leave, I never come back. And what happens if it's 2, 3, 4, 5 months later that you find it?
Sure.
Well, there's definitely no camera footage that I was ever there.
Long ago been deleted.
Right. So there's no camera footage I was ever there. If I wiped the device down, there's no fingerprints I was there. And as long as I wasn't stupid enough to bring a cell phone with me, you can't geofence me. So it's like, okay, good luck. And if I'm a foreign national, if I was a Russian person, even if you found out who I was, I'm going to be long gone.
Sure.
So at that point, it's like, what do you do? Right? Like, so this is, your incident response. If you want to make them terrified, if you want to make them just like their jaw hit the floor and make them sweat, give them that scenario. Okay,
Sure.
we just had our annual secret project where we talked about every secret project we're working on in detail, and we talked about our financial decisions for the next year, and we talked about which persons we're going to be firing, et cetera, et cetera. And then we found a listening device in that room. What do we do?
Sure.
Like,
I'd love to talk a little bit more about, these common. So, someone who has been resistant to an offensive physical security pen test finally acquiesces and realizes, okay, we do need one, and you're sharing your findings. What are the things that tend to shock them most?
Well, a lot of things do. The things that typically shock. So, like I said, most organizations understand that you can sneak in. That's usually not something that they're concerned about. What they're most shocked by, in my experience, is the totality of how fast and effectively you could bring the entire organization down. Every organization, from a military to a government to a corporate, entity, is like a game of Jenga. It's a series of blocks that are precariously put up, and they have multiple sections where 1 or 2 blocks holds everything up. And if that block is stolen, destroyed, or compromised, the whole thing falls apart. And when you run an engagement on most organizations and you show them, oh yeah, within 1 to 2 weeks or maybe a month, I was able to, and here's a laundry list of ways that I could compromise you, and here's all this data I stole, and here's all the source code for your secret projects, and et cetera, et cetera. That is what terrifies people, and that's usually what is the huge, saucer-sized eyes in the boardroom. They're like, "Oh my God, how did you do that?" Those are the kinds of things, because they don't realize. When you ask most entities, most C-suite, what are you most concerned about? They say cybersecurity. Okay, what is it about cybersecurity? Well, we'd be terrified if we got hit with ransomware or someone compromised the server. It's always the server, right? Okay, well, I got it within 5 days. I was in your server rack. Here's a picture of me with a bash bunny. Your server rack's unlocked, and I can inject anything that I want into it, and it's going to completely screw you. And I've bypassed all your external security. So it's stuff like that. It's just people don't understand how catastrophic those types of breaches really could be. It's kind of like, most people kind of take for granted that they have a cell phone and they have, emails and other things. Imagine how compromised you would really be if a person who specifically wanted to make your life a living hell got your unlocked phone.
Sure.
They changed your passwords. They deleted your accounts. They dumped data. They like how much damage could they do to you just with an unlocked phone, right? And it's that type of thing. It's like that people just don't realize until it happens, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, now I get it.
And to be perfectly honest, I feel like 5 days, a week, 2 weeks, a month is honestly longer than I usually hear from you. Like a lot of times you'll get into these places in like a day or a couple of days.
Yeah, so, okay, to be fair, there are a lot of clients who will not be able to pay for a full 2, 3, 4, 5 week pen test. They just can't afford it. And that's perfectly viable. It will be up to you as the pen tester to decide, can I actually offer the client a high quality service? So for example, anybody who's listening to this, who's ever done cyber pen testing, a typical web app is going to run about a week, right? So you're going to spend about 4 days running the test and about 1 day doing the reporting. But what would happen if the client came to you and said, we want you to do the same test, but you have 3 hours?
Sure.
Do you do the test because the quality of the work is not going to be very high? Now, in some instances, that might make sense. Some web apps might be so simple or so small that you could do it in one day. Some buildings are going to be so small that you could do it in one day.
I'm not saying that the pen test itself was only a day or two long. What I mean is that by luck or brilliance, you have found your way to the server very fast.
Yeah, of course.
Very fast.
Yeah, of course. So now, of course that happens. But the thing is that when you're running a pen test, you typically don't want to move inside very quickly to avoid kind of the Leroy Jenkins thing where you're just like, oh, I see the open door, let's go for it. So yes, you can discover routes and vulnerabilities very fast, but you should hold off, if possible, on breaching until you have all the evidence. Because the number of times that I've seen people rush into a building and then realize, oh, I tailgated in, but I needed a badge to get out, or some derivative thereof, is quite high. And you avoid those problems and those things the more recon you do. Now, that said, going back a step, it is always possible that you will have engagements where the client will say, well, I can only afford to do, 3 days, 4 days, 5 days, something. And that's doable if you have experience. So just like everything else, right? If I asked a novice painter to paint me a canvas, well, if they told me, well, I can do it in a week. Okay, fine. But a master might be able to do it in an hour, right? So the better you are at this skill, the shorter and more kind of, that's what I'm looking for.
Efficient?
Yeah, efficient, I guess. I was going to say, what's the word I'm looking for where you, things that you don't want. Like there are conditions that you would rather not have on this. So there's a lot of things. I'd rather the pen test be 2 weeks, but okay, I could do it.
You can accommodate more concessions.
Yeah, sure. We can accommodate more concessions. The better you are.
Sure.
And so yes, you can do that. Now, there are other ways to do this, right? You could say, okay, rather than like a pure black box test, if you're only going to give me, say, 3 days, well, okay, then you need to help me out here. You need to tell me where in the building this is. You need to, give me some more information. Because I would have discovered this on the recon, but because basically
you don't want to pay for the recon.
Right, if you don't want to pay for the recon, you got to help me out here. So, yes, if you're doing these types of things, there are ways that you can work with the client to make it happen. But I will say this. The overwhelming majority of clients who have never done anything when it comes to physical are not ready for a pen test. They need an audit. They don't need a pen test first because they're right. You will find 30 ways to get inside. But they're not ready for that yet. What they need is they need an audit. So you can help them to raise the defense skills and maturity up to a point where then it makes sense to come back and test it.
Sure. Now let's presume you've conducted an offensive, physical pen test and you're sharing your findings and say you got to the server and within 5 days, including recon.
Right.
That should be a wow moment for people. But do you ever have clients who, even at that stage, resist the value of those findings?
Yeah, so there's a couple, I would say, general groups of people who might give you pushback. The first one, which makes perfect sense, is somebody, your facility manager, your security guards, your physical SOC, anybody who's in charge of physical security might legitimately give you pushback because basically it's their job, right? Their job is on the line. If you come in and say, yeah, I was able to compromise you completely, then that looks really bad. So it'd kind of be like, say, if you go do a pen test on a website and you find out that all the credentials for the company's bank accounts were hard-coded into the source code of the website, well, that's super bad. And the programmer who did that probably is going to lose his job. So yes, you will typically get pushback, or you might get pushback from them. Anybody who basically you are kind of showing they're not doing a good job. Another group of people will say, sometimes it's usually like the C-suite, maybe it's the CISO, might say something like, well, okay, yeah, but we don't see this as realistic. We don't see this as a viable threat. Like, yes, you did it, but you're a professional. You know what you're doing, and the average person couldn't. And then you need to kind of walk them through. It's like, yes, I was able to do this in a week because of these reasons. But your employees who work for you, they know all of these vulnerabilities. They are aware of all of these things. And if for any reason they were tricked or decided to compromise you, they could. using the exact same methods, the exact same tactics, the exact same routes that I did, but they would bypass all of the external stuff. They wouldn't have to jump the fence and clone the badge or anything, because you've given it to them. They just walk in through the front door. They wave at you. You wave back. And if they decide, you know what, I'm going to inject some malware into the server and I'm going to do, whatever, they can, because you've given them access and you've allocated some flat physical network. So oftentimes, if you do get pushback, you just have to help them to frame it in a way. And also, it really helps if you understand why they're giving you pushback. If somebody's giving you pushback because their job is on the line, it's not personal.
Sure.
If somebody's giving you pushback because they're saying, look, okay, you did this, but you're a professional and we don't see it as a viable threat, that's not them saying that we don't believe you. That's them saying, like, help me understand why we should care.
Sure. Now, in terms of bringing the pillars together, in an ideal world, how would these 3 pillars work in unison?
Right. So the compliance is the first thing you need, right? The first thing that you need is you need to make sure that you have all the things that you need for security. Maybe that's fences, alarms, cameras, firewalls.
And that might be an audit sort of situation.
Well, you're not sure, but you're not at an audit yet. So compliance is just your compliance team is going to have a checklist of, okay, we run a bank. What kinds of things do we need for physical security for a bank? Here's the checklist, right? Okay, let's make sure that we have those things. That's your compliance test. Then you're going to have your defense, and they're going to say, okay, given what the compliance team gave us, given the tools they gave us, what should we do with those tools? Well, here's the industry standards of what we should do. We should do this, we should do that. Okay, and we're going to do those things. The offensive team are going to come in and say, okay, I am now looking at the compliance, the things you have, the fences, the alarms, the cameras, the guards, whatever. And then I'm going to watch their behavior and see how are they actually using it. Kind of like the guard who opens the door and, the door takes 20, 30 seconds to close. Just because you have all those things, you have, good hardened doors and you have alarms on those doors and you have guards and those guards have protocols where they have to go and check every door every day. All of those things are great. But they bring about a security vulnerability because of how they're operating, because how they're used. And that's the offensive side of things. We look at what you've put in place. We look at the tools that you have and how you're using those tools, and then we test them. And then once we've tested them and we've given you a report, we offer you remediation and you go back and fix them. So you change and adjust. Then we come back a year later and we say, okay, let's do another test. Let's see if you're still using things better or if you've brought in some other problems. Right? So, maybe your building has expanded. Maybe a wing of your building is now owned by a different company. Maybe you're in maybe you moved from a static building to a shared office complex. Any of these things could happen, and they do happen. And so you want to come back and check and validate. I mean, let's be honest, retention is a real thing, right? So employees don't always stick around for companies for careers anymore. A lot of employees will stick around for 1, 2, maybe 3 or 4 years, and then they leave. Okay, well, if we did a pen test on your company and all the internal security was like, okay, you taught us what to do and now we're doing it. But then they left and a new batch of people came in and now maybe they're not.
Sure.
Right? So you come back in and you just kind of repeat this process.
Do you ever feel like, understanding the reality that budgets are limited, do you ever feel like it's important to discuss with, say, an offensive security professional before you factor in the compliance in terms of physical security? So I'm thinking the example you just gave of a bank that says, okay, we're a bank, here are all the things that we need to do to secure our facility, and then they hand that off to the blue team, and the blue team implements them. Okay, but if the people putting together the compliance checklist don't understand, high frequency, low frequency cards, or, this camera is vulnerable to that attack, they're spending a lot of limited money on systems that don't actually improve their security by as much as they think they're doing. So it kind of, as much as you say it starts with the compliance, it kind of starts with like fact finding, which involves discussing with offensive security people.
Sure. So ideally, that is your compliance, though.
Okay.
Ideally, your compliance team ought to know the best standards and why. Mm-hmm. See, it's that second part of and why that's really important. If you say to somebody, well, having this type of access control card is important. Well, they need to back that up with but why is it important? Because if they don't understand the why, then you might say, okay, well, we have this card and it's high frequency and it's unclonable. And that's what we're supposed to use. But you know what? In this part of the world, I just can't find a vendor who's willing to do that. But I have a different high-frequency card, and it looks similar. And the card reader, like, it's the same card reader that they use, so it's probably fine. If they don't understand that one is unclonable and one isn't, they don't understand that why you're doing it, then they might make that mistake. So a lot of this comes in because, well, a lot of it is ushered in a lot of steps. But in this case, it would be ushered in through the compliance, not understanding why are we doing the things we're doing. But again, when you're talking about offensive work, it doesn't matter the security that you've put in place. What matters is we will, as the offensive team, we will look at whatever it is that you have put into place and figure out, is there a way, based on what you have, to get in realistically? And that's really what it comes down to. Different clients will have different needs. So if you're talking like a government, a government entity, well, a government entity probably needs to be literally concerned with state actors, right? The FSB, the GRU, the CCP, all these, sure. But Bob's Burgers down the street does not need to be worried about the KGB or the Mossad, right? Like that's not...
Unless Bob's Burgers isn't Bob's Burgers.
Right, exactly. So if I was to say, if I'm going and dealing with a government organization, and I say, have you vetted all your employees? And they say, absolutely. We send every person through a vetting process, blah, blah, blah. And I said, but what about the cleaning staff? And they say, oh, well, we don't vet them because they're a third party. Okay, well, don't you think that if a state entity might take an agent and say, okay, well, we need you to work for this cleaning staff for the next 5 years so that you can get access to this government facility, which will give you keys to the kingdom so you can roam around and put bugs and copy documents and everything else. That's a real thing that you might have to worry about, but only for certain clients. And so understanding the client's needs, understanding, all of these things, it's super important. But going back to your question, it doesn't really matter if you start with compliance, offensive security, or anything else. What matters is that you have them all. And in an ideal world, your compliance people would know these are the things that we need, and here's why we need them. Then the defense would take those tools, use them correctly, offensive team would come in and fail. In an ideal world, the offensive team is going to come in and they're going to just bang against a wall and be like, nope, can't find a single way in. When you go to the doctor and he runs a bunch of tests on you and he comes back and says, nope, you're perfectly healthy, you don't look at him and say, well, you suck as a doctor.
Sure.
Right? No, you look at him and say, okay, that's great. That's the way it's supposed to be. Right? My health is supposed to be healthy. So when you're on the offensive team, what ought to happen is you ought to fail. If everything is going well, you ought to fail. But 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, that's not going to be the case. You're going to find ways in. You're going to find vulnerabilities. You're going to find things to compromise. And that's why you do it. Because there's always something that somebody's doing either maliciously or stupidly or something that you can take advantage of.
A moment ago you said it's not, starting with this one or starting with that one. It's that you are investing in all three. But we know that people tend to kind of put offensive security last. And a lot of companies, because they put offensive security last, can't always afford to invest in a full black team engagement.
Sure.
What do you recommend when that's the reality of the company you're wanting to work with?
Right. So are you asking about an engagement or a team?
Either.
Okay.
Either one.
Right. So when it comes to an engagement, let's say that the company wants to do, they've understood that physical security is important. They've understood that, they need to test it. Great. But they say, hey, look, we don't have the budget for it. We at best could hire, 3 days for a test. Well, then you, as the professional, need to look at that and work with the client and then ask them, is there a way we could make this happen? So you are not going to be able, let's say it's a hospital, right? Hospitals are massive, sprawling complexes. If the hospital asks you to run an audit or run a pen test on them in 3 days, which includes the report, turn it down. Because if that's where the thing begins and ends, you cannot offer a complex, a realistic, quality, investment. You just can't. But what you could do is you could say, okay, look, I can do a best effort kind of thing. These are the things, we're going to limit the scope to this, that, and the other thing. You're going to help me because I'm not going to have time to do the recon. So you're going to have to give me, I'm going to have to basically work with an insider or something. You can try to work that around. But at the same time, you might have to say no. Mm-hmm. You might have to say, look, save your pennies, come back next year, and let's do a full, engagement. You could.
And what is the danger of for lack of a better word, kind of being forced to half-ass it.
Right. So, So this is the big problem with half-assing offensive work. Your job is to be a reality check for the defensive team. The defensive team obviously thinks they're doing everything right. I mean, assumedly,
if they didn't, they should be changing the way they do it.
Right. If they literally thought, no, we suck at our job, okay, that's its own problem. But the defensive team believes they're doing everything correct, and they have secured the facility to the best of their ability. But if the offensive team comes here and does a professional job, and let's say they find 10 different routes into the building, and 5 of those routes are minimal effort, right? It takes nothing. A rear door that's always left unlocked. Or I can go through another building, go through their door, and poof, I'm just in your server room, right? So, and you find 10 different routes into the building. But let's say the client can only afford to pay you for, 3 days. And in that 3 days, you only find 2 of those routes.
Sure.
Then what happens is you give them a report and say, if you fix these 2 routes, you're secure. And you're not. What you've done is you've given them false confidence. You've told them that you are totally secure. And this hurts both of you. Because for them, they believe they're secure. For you, you have given the stamp of approval from your company or your person that says, I guarantee that you are secure in this event. And they're not.
Sure. So it's more about being comprehensive.
Well, yes, of course. Because so when you're running a pen test, your goal is not to just get in. That's not the goal. The goal is to get in as many times and in many ways as possible in the time allotted and to show value to the client. So if the client says, our ultimate goal is for you to get into the server room and take a picture of yourself, with a bash bunny in front of an unlocked server rack, because we want to scare the hell out of the board of directors into increasing our security budget. Okay, that's the goal. Then that's what you need to do. But if they tell you, look, we want, this laundry list of things, then you got to do a laundry list of things. But at the end of the day, most buildings and most organizations have more than one route into the building. And if you start and end with one way in and you give them that report, they're not secure. You have fixed one of N different routes. And you as the pen tester don't even know how many there are. So how can the client know how many there are?
Sure.
That's why recon is so important. Because if you discover 10 different routes through recon, but you only have time for one, or you only have confidence that one will work, and the client has said under no circumstance can you get caught. It is vital that you do not get caught. And you can tell the client, look, we found 10 possible routes, but only one of them had high probability that we would get in, get out, accomplish everything without getting caught. So we didn't do the rest. But in the report, you should still list them. You should still say, we didn't do this because you said it was vital that we don't get caught, but we think that this might have also worked. And we think this might have also worked, and blah, 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 and write all of those out. Because if you don't do that, the client will not be aware that it's a problem, and then they won't do it. Again, think about it like a doctor. If a doctor runs a blood test on you, and he finds 10 different things wrong with your blood, but he only tells you to fix one thing, well, you don't even know that there's other things wrong with you, right? It is in your best interest to know everything.
Absolutely. And I feel like that's actually a really good place to stop. But before we do, is there anything else that we should talk about on this topic that we haven't touched on already?
I mean, I think that we've covered a lot, but at the end of the day, the premise of this podcast, this episode, is that security is based on 3 things, right? Compliance, do you have all the tools that you need to be secure? Whether that's through the internet, whether that's in your own home, whether that's through your business, whatever. Do you have the tools needed? Defense is, how are you using those tools? And then the offense is, don't be afraid to do a reality check. Because the reality check it's literally just checking, okay, am I actually where I think I am? Am I actually as good as I think I am? Am I actually comprehensively securing things to the way I think I'm doing it? And oftentimes the answer is going to be no. And you can improve, right? You can always improve, but you won't improve nearly as much or nearly as quickly if you don't test yourself.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us for this episode on the 3 pillars of security. If you'd like info on how to get into black teaming, visit covertaccessteam.com. And if you're already experienced in physical security but want to learn how to run solo engagements, take a look at our Strategic Operations for Lone Operators solo course running this June. We'll see you next time.